There it is. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and call this meeting to order. And would the secretary please call the roll?
President Mason,
Present?
Vice President Lassane,
Present.
Director Berg,
Present.
Director Mitchell,
Present.
Director Nichols.
Oh, I saw him flash for a moment.
He's here. There. I see his name.
He came and went. So there he is again. We'll go ahead and get started and just pay attention to when maybe you see him pop on screen and add him as well.
I'm here. I'm just
There he is.
just for whatever reason my video is not working, so I might jump
Welcome.
off and jump back on.
Okay, welcome. Dr. Salzman, did you want to provide an overview of tonight's agenda, or shall we just go ahead and adopt it by general consent?
That'd be great to adopt it, but just Madam Chair and to the board, good evening. And I think you'll enjoy the presentation, but go ahead, Madam Chair. To approve it by consent is fine.
Okay. And I just wanted to, for director's knowledge, point out that our special meetings do not include a flag salute or I should say a pledge of allegiance or a land acknowledgement. And so until we choose to change that order of business, we will go forward with the way that our special meetings have always run. And with that, we are going to move into our work study. And I imagine that Dr. Matthews is the one that's going to be with us tonight.
I am. All right.
For a long time, right?
Share my screen with you. There you go. You should be seeing my presentation.
We do.
All right. Well, thank you for having me here this evening to talk about our annual achievement report. I have several learning targets for us this evening in this study session. So the first being understand the challenges and opportunities that our canceled state assessments have afforded us. Learn the dual roles of assessment and how that plays out in both accountability and achievement to improve student learning. Understand how performance matters, analytics, and assessment tools are being used to better understand our students' learning, and understand how our diagnostic assessments help us to inform both instruction and improve student learning. This work today is grounded in our strategic plan, specifically 1.1, 1.2, and 1.5. So students graduating ready for college, career, and life, equitable access to rigorous curriculum content with common learning outcomes and assessments, and then of course meeting or exceeding the federal, state, and performance requirements, federal and state performance requirements. And this work also falls under two of our 4 pillars, systems and instruction. And while performance matters is explicitly part of our 4 sort of big rocks that we're working on this year, it's also important to put this work in the place of equitable outcomes. So when we have better systems to explore student performance data, then we can identify areas that we could celebrate and expand in our work. We can evaluate the need for programs and the effectiveness of those programs to meet the needs of all students. We can evaluate trends and we can evaluate the opportunity gaps that exist. But when we have strong standards aligned assessment systems in place, it also informs our instruction irrespective of the demographics of our students so that we can change the outcomes for all students. And what we know is that data and assessments, they're very much aligned. However, simply giving a test really changes nothing. It gives us good information, but it really doesn't change anything. What changes things is, or changes student learning outcomes, is when we take the data from those assessments and we use them to understand student learning and provide that informed instruction to our teachers, so that 180 days, all of our students have access to highly qualified teachers in a standards aligned curriculum, moving their learning forward. So while we look at this data, again, I want to emphasize that we're not just talking about the systems that are in place, but also how it impacts instruction. So first, challenges and opportunities. So of course, last spring, the state canceled our spring assessments due to building closures. And that really created a bit of a hole in our data, as state assessments obviously provide a huge data point in terms of whether or not students are meeting those grade level standards each year. So that hole in the data, that's used as schools plan their school improvement plans. It's used as we plan intervention programs. Unfortunately, that hole in the data is also a data point in terms of the trend that we're seeing. And OSPI was not successful this year in asking for a waiver of state assessments from the U.S. Department of Education. So we really have to be thinking forward to this spring in terms of our accountability. And we're going to do that with a gap in that key piece of data. However, it has provided us with some pretty big opportunities. And one of those is that we adopted, or excuse me, we purchased Performance Matters this year, which is allowing us to get a deeper dive into the existing data in a very different way. And because we're missing this key piece of information, there's a huge motivation for us to look at the data differently. So what is it that we actually know about our students, and how can that inform our work going forward? And then in addition, we have the iReady program, which helps us to identify our students' progress toward meeting grade level standards, but more importantly, it identifies gaps in students' learning and provides that online learning path so we can fill in those gaps and get students to standard. So today I want to talk, first I want to talk a little bit about the difference between accountability and achievement, but also how they are aligned. So accountability is really about meeting state and federal benchmarks with our proficiency on state assessments and with our proficiency around the elements of the Washington School Improvement Framework. So these are requirements that we need to make based on state and federal laws, and they're important. There's no question about that. In fact, if you were in education pre the accountability era, as I was, say the 80s, you know that accountability really changed the game for our students, because schools really had to start thinking about every single group of students by their demographics. Which is not to say that the demographics are anything that we should consider, say, as an excuse or as an explanation, but rather understanding that our kids have different needs. And if a group is falling behind, then we need to serve them in a better and different way. Prior to accountability, we really looked at all students. So if you were, for example, reaching that 80% mark in proficiency, you might think that you're doing really well. However, it hid the students who weren't meeting proficiency, and often those were those groups that are more vulnerable academically, special education students, ELL students, some of our different subgroups. So accountability, we need to attend to that for sure. And we had a pass this year, frankly, on accountability, because with the loss of those SBA scores, we're not able to calculate the Washington School Improvement Framework. and we're missing that big data point. So this is where really achievement is an important metric to think about in terms of student learning, because achievement is really about how are we meeting the needs of the students who are in front of us today. Okay, so accountability, we think of the trends, how have fourth graders done over time? But with achievement, what we're really saying is, who do we have right now in our classrooms? What has been their performance metrics over time, and how are we going to serve those students so that we can raise their achievement level and bring them all to standard, and ultimately graduating college, career, and life ready. So achievement is about looking forward. How does it improve our instruction or inform our instruction, inform our interventions, and inform program development to meet the needs of all students? So accountability, we'll take a look at the data that we do have, because it is important to understand this data, even though we're absent a data point, because we'll be held responsible to it in the spring. So here are our 5th grade Smarter Balanced scores. We won't have 2020, but you can see going into this year that though we have performed better than the state in orange, we've been flat in ELA, right in the the low 70% mark. While math has increased a little bit, 5% over 5 years is really not that much. And in science, we took a huge dip with the implementation of the Washington Comprehensive Assessment of Science in 2018, and really haven't recovered from that. We took a dip in 18 and in 19. In 8th grade, similarly, you can see ELA has been flat. Math also has been flat, and as with 5th grade, math performance has been lower than ELA performance over time. And again, with science, though we did see a slight uptick in 2018, we had a huge drop from 2017 to 2018. You can see there at 62.5%. And then our high school metrics with 10th grade ELA and math and 11th grade science. So again, ELA pretty flat, although we were at a high in 2017 and we took a slight dip in 18 and 19. And math, you can see that we've sort of leveled off from 2017. So we had an increase from that really low score in 22.4% in 2015. Remember, that's the year when accountability went to 11th grade or 10th grade, but the, accountability went to 11th grade and the graduation exam was at 10th grade. So there wasn't this impetus to take the exam, and we had a low turnout at some schools. But regardless, we've really only made a slight improvement over time, and certainly 40% is not where we want to be. Likewise, in science, you see this huge dip in 2018. Science was to be a graduation requirement, and then of course that was changed. And so we had a considerable dip there as well, as did the state. So the other metric that we look at is the Washington School Improvement Framework, because this is what determines our schools that are going to get comprehensive and targeted support. It's the grade basically for schools in Washington State. And just as a reminder, elementary and middle school, they get their score from proficiency in ELA and math on the SBA. Science will be added this year, and that's 40% of their metric. Student growth percentiles, the median school student growth percentile for math and ELA is 50% of the metric. And then English learner progress is 5%, as is regular attendance or chronic absenteeism. And then high school, because they don't have growth, 50% of their rate is based on graduation rather than growth. And notice that proficiency is only 30%, and that's because they have two additional metrics: the 9th grade on track to graduate, and then the advanced course taking or dual credit course taking. So schools look at their performance over time on the Washington School Improvement Framework, and this is the overall score, but of course, schools dive deeply into the data that is behind this. So here are our elementary schools. And these schools in green here have Washington School Improvement Framework overall scores higher than 8.0, which is fairly good. And we even have some schools that are in the 9.9 range, which is excellent. These schools in yellow are above 5, but they are not at that 8.0. And then we have 3 of those schools that have had substantial increases over time. So Madison, notice, started at 3.2 3 years ago and went up to 6.9 in that span of 2 years, which is excellent. Lowell going up a full level, 1 point or 1 decile, and Jackson going up 1.2 deciles. And then we have Hawthorne that has remained right around that 4.7 range, very flat for these 3 years. Again, this won't be recalculated until after this coming spring because we're missing that metric from this last spring. So when we dig into this data and look at the groups that over time have shown gaps, opportunity gaps, for example, our transitional bilingual students have been significantly lower than the all for schools. So you see Mill Creek here is one that has hit that 8 decile mark. And then we have a few schools that have been greater than 5, but more of our schools have been less than that 5.0 range. And in fact, we have a couple of schools that have dropped and are in danger of being in that target zone. Emerson and Hawthorne, for example. Lowell is also low, but has had a steady increase over time. And then we've had this drop here for Monroe as well. The other group that has been substantially lower than the overall score has been students with disabilities. And you can see Silver Firs is the only school that broke that 8.0. And that's after 2 years of pretty substantial growth from 6.1. We have a number of schools that are above 5. And then we have a number of schools that are still below that 5.0 mark and actually kind of in dangerous zones. So we see Emerson dropping to 1.1 here and Garfield going from 6.8 to 3.6, Lowell staying steady at 1.5, and Hawthorne, though it had a bump of 1 decile, it's dropped back down to 2.0, so that's a concern. Students who qualify for free and reduced meals, typically their performance has been a bit lower than the all. I will say that in comparison to students with disabilities in ELL, their performance has been higher. So we have 2 schools that are above that 8.0 in 2019. And we have a number of schools that are above the 5.0 mark, and really only about 4 schools that are below that 5.0 mark. And notice that Madison here, again, as you saw with some of their other metrics, going from 2.7 to 6.1 is pretty substantial increase in their decile scores over time. We see Jackson making an increase of about a decile as well. For elementary, for African American or Black students, notice that there are quite a few schools where the data is suppressed, so they did not meet that threshold for their grade levels. So it doesn't mean that there are no students, it just means that there's no score because they didn't meet that threshold. So Mill Creek hitting that 8.0 mark. We have 3 schools at the above that 5, and Jefferson very close to meeting that 8.0. And then Hawthorne, Monroe, and Penny Creek below that 5.0. And actually Hawthorne shouldn't be in there because they were suppressed in 2019. I'm sorry for that. It's a concern. There are a couple of schools that have dropped in this group. They are a smaller group of students, so their scores are going to fluctuate more on individual differences. So if you think about performance, if you have a group of 500 students, 5 student change is only a 1% change, right? But if you have a group of 20 students and there's a 5 student change, that's a 25% change in their performance. So the challenge with smaller groups is that you see a greater fluctuation of their scores. The opportunity with smaller groups is that you can connect with more students in that group because there are less of them, and really target assistance for them. For our Hispanic and Latinx students, obviously none suppressed, they're a much larger group. And you can see Mill Creek and Silver Firs again reaching that 8.0 mark. A majority of schools above 5, but not quite at 8. And then again, seeing Madison, that big jump from 2.4 all the way to 6.3 in 2 years. And then Lowell, 3.5 to 5.8 is a very big jump. And then we have, oops, Madison should be yellow. My apologies. Hawthorne and Emerson falling below that 5.0, and both of those schools dropping. Middle schools did not have quite the drastic changes in performance as we saw in the elementary schools. So, you know, for example, Evergreen, there is a little dip here, but it's a 0.5, a half of a decile, and this upward trend is about 0.4 of a decile. So Gateway breaking that 8.0 mark, however, a little bit of a drop each year from 9.4 to 8.7. Eisenhower, Evergreen, Heatherwood and North in that yellow zone above 5.0, but not hitting 8.0. And a slight uptick for North, and a slight drop here for Eisenhower of 1 decile. For the middle schools, obviously, you aggregate 18 elementaries into 5 middle schools, you're going to get larger population sizes. And so we see our African American or Black students in these groups. So we have Evergreen and Gateway above that 5.0, the remaining schools below the 5.0. And we do see an increase so Heatherwood seeing a 2.0 decile increase, and North a 1.4. Those are pretty substantial. Though Eisenhower went up a little bit, we have to look at it in consideration of that first score. So 3.3 to 4.0 is not quite recovering from their 2017 score. Our Hispanic and Latinx students at middle school, we see most of the schools in that yellow zone, so none hitting 8.0 in 2019. Eisenhower seeing a drop from 5.2 to 3.4. And if you'll recall, when we talked about the Washington School Improvement Framework, the threshold there is that highest score for the lowest 5% of schools. So when it was last calculated, it was 2.3. So we definitely don't want schools to be dropping into that 3.0 zone. So these are our transitional bilingual students for middle school, and Evergreen above 5.0, all the rest of the schools are below. And this is similar to what we saw at elementary school as well. Eisenhower, a pretty substantial drop, as well as Gateway for these students. And again, at some of these schools, this is a fairly small population, so you're going to see greater fluctuations. And then here is our students with disabilities for middle school. All of the schools are below that 5.0 for 2019, so that is a concern. Eisenhower and Heatherwood having pretty large drops. So Eisenhower dropping 1 full decile, and while Heatherwood is 0.8 below where they were in 2017, they actually had an increase. So they're a little bigger drop there. And then as we saw in elementary school, the students who qualify for free and reduced meals, they're performing better than students with disabilities and better than ELL students, but still not as well as they could be. So we have 4 schools that are above that 5.0 with Eisenhower below that. Like to see those, of course, go higher, and Eisenhower the drop of 1 decile in that as well. So just the same way that 18 elementaries fed into 5 middle schools, those 5 middle schools primarily feed into 3 traditional high schools with a small alternative high school. And so again, the fluctuations in numbers are going to be a lot less. And that is because they're larger populations. So change of a single student or even a group of students doesn't have quite as drastic an effect. So you can see here in the overall score, Jackson being above that 8.0 and making sort of a steady, modest improvement over time. Cascade and Everett above the 5.0 and Sequoia below the 5.0 with a slight drop there in the last year. And when we look at their groups of students, this is what I mean by not a huge amount of fluctuation, because even with a small group, it's a lot larger than we would see at any one elementary school. So we're seeing a slight improvement at Cascade, a slight improvement at Everett and Jackson, but not a full decile. Here's our Hispanic and Latinx students. That's an even larger group. And again, a little bit of fluctuation there at Cascade, tiny drop, mostly flat at Everett, and a slight increase at Jackson. As with elementary and middle school, our ELL transitional bilingual students performing less well than the all. And it's interesting, we have one group above 5.0, and that's Everett, which has a fairly large population of TBL students. And over time, that group has increased from 3.9 to 5.8. Cascade dropping about 0.6 and almost a full decile drop at Jackson. And then students with disabilities, again, a little bit lower than the all, well, sorry, substantially lower than the all. And we see that Cascade has had a drop of a little bit more than a full decile. And while Everett High's made a slight increase, it's only 0.5 above where they were in 2017, and likewise for Henry M. Jackson. As with elementary and middle school, our free and reduced meals students done better than our EL or students with disabilities in terms of the WSIF elements. And while it is not as high as the all, you can see that Cascade has made a growth of more than a decile in the 2 years, and Henry M. Jackson almost a full decile from 2017, and then with a slight drop at Cascade. So before I move on to achievement, I want to take a pause here because that was a lot of data. and check in with all of you about what questions you might have to this point.
Thank you for that data is just so powerful in helping us understand. And you do such a good job of walking us through it and pulling it together. So great first start to the presentation. I was going to ask real quick, are the math scores, I believe I've seen they are both statewide and national in terms of being lower than the ELA scores?
That is true, yes.
So we just haven't figured out math as a nation, I guess. So, directors, I'm going to go ahead and open it up, and please just speak up if you have questions or observations.
Just a quick question. Is the reason we didn't see Sequoia on the last few slides, is that just because their data was suppressed because it was too
Yes.
low of a number?
Yeah, thank you. I should have mentioned that. Yes, Sequoia has very small subgroups and they are suppressed.
And Catherine, can you, I know you said this earlier, but I didn't catch, why is 8.0 and 5.0 the benchmarks?
Well, so to some degree they're arbitrary, but really 8.0 is you're better than 80% of the schools' performance in the state. And so hitting that 8.0 is, you know, I guess we could set that really at any point, but we definitely don't want to be below the 50% mark, right? So that's doing less well than half the schools in the state. So yeah, so they're a little bit arbitrary, but it's the benchmarks that we look for in terms of schools that are doing very well and schools that are doing good and schools that need to be improving.
And what is the 5.0? What percentage is that roughly?
5.0 would be, if you're below 5.0, then you're doing less well than more than 50% of the schools in the state.
Mm-hmm.
So we definitely don't want to be below 5.0.
Okay. Other directors?
Yeah, I've got a question. So you might be, if you're going to cover this later, then you can totally ignore it. So I'm just wondering, what are some of the potential consequences of not getting the waiver? I know Superintendent Reichdahl is just like beside himself at having the waiver denied. But I'm wondering, just for our specific district, like what some of the potential consequences would be if we do poorly on this next set of assessments.
Well, so here's the situation. Our state's system for assessing schools overall is the Washington School Improvement Framework. And that establishment of the cutoff initially was 2.3 and it will, or 3.2, and it will be recalculated. If you fall below that for all your students, then you are in comprehensive support. So the state of Washington comes in and they provide support to help you improve your school, okay? So one consequence is we don't want to have schools that are considered below that mark or in support, right? The reality of the situation is this. We're all going to have to take this test as a state, right? And we'll be in the same boat as every other school district in the state, right? So when that level is calculated, remember it's relative to everyone else. So that threshold is the highest score of the lowest 5% of schools, performing schools. So I don't like to guesstimate or, you know, but I would have to say I would be shocked if we were ever in that position.
And I guess with that 3.2 cutoff, so you got, so those are like the three, I feel like for me, just looking at the numbers, so you got the 8, the 5, and then 3.2, right? And that's like the red, that's, I remember like the No Child Left Behind, right? That was the, like the, the bells and whistles go off. Do we have schools that are either there right now or that have the potentiality to be there? I guess I'm just wondering if as a district we should be saying, okay, here are the 5 schools, K-12 that we're like in there's the potential for them to not meet that basic threshold.
So we did not have any schools in comprehensive support. We had a couple of schools that fell below the threshold for the special ed population, one school for American Indian students. And so they got targeted support, right? So in answer to your question, right now, no school is really in that position of as a school being below that threshold.
Okay, so that was kind of perfect.
Yeah.
Well, I was just gonna say my next question was about targeted support. So there is that availability, right? So as we look at the different populations, the demographic breakdowns, there can be targeted support. So it's not as if, to your earlier point, how back in the day, the numbers kind of hid, right? Those demographic outliers. And so now we have that ability. Okay, and when you say targeted support, is that what we're providing or do the feds come in and
it's from the state.
From the state.
State has OSPI has a whole department that provides support to schools, and it would be very much targeted. So these are the schools, or these are the groups that fell below that that level, and this is the support that they would need. Yes.
Catherine, can I add one more thing to that, just in terms of how we are focusing our supports intentionally on schools in a kind of a color-coded fashion. We try to keep that information front and center when we prioritize resources after IRs, both human and material resources for schools. So a lot of these schools that are below the 5.0 threshold in different subgroups, we are targeting support in that fashion as well.
And if I can actually just jump in as well, I think one of the pieces, in the earlier slides, Catherine was really talking about the difference between achievement and accountability. And even though we are in our current state, we still are holding ourselves accountable to the learning of all of our students. And so, I understand thinking about like, okay, we're in this really weird pandemic. How are we delivering instruction? We still have an obligation to our students and our families to hold accountable all of our people in our system to make sure that we're moving our students forward, which is really, we're finding is very challenging. But as Dr. Scott just said, it is at the forefront of all of the work we do. So when we think about what are the supports we provide during instructional review action plans, what are we doing to help target those students so that we can make sure that they are making growth, that they are achieving at high levels. And I think that's always, we think about targeted support with the Office of, I think it's Systems and Support from OSSI. But really what we think about internally within our system is what are the targeted supports we can offer to each school to help make sure that all students, regardless of their groups, are all achieving.
That's awesome to hear. And thank you, Dr. Matthews, for the visual, because to Dr. Scott's point, I am like hyper visual. And so seeing the reds make me all of a sudden, it triggers those thoughts and questions. So, and thank you, Dr. Brogan, for that explanation of the targeted support, because that does like help me sleep better at night, knowing that that's, it's not just an afterthought for us as a district. So that's awesome.
Yeah, never an afterthought. It is the air that we breathe.
Yeah.
And Dr. Salzman's vision is always about student achievement, and that is the air that we breathe in this district now. So we're really excited about the work that we're doing. Hardest work we've ever done, but really excited about it.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions before we move on? I just want to add a couple observations that I noticed in the data, which I've seen before in the data, but the two are the schools that seem to have the larger populations of the different subgroups seem to have more positive trends, because I think they actually figure out how to do the work, which is kind of interesting. And then again, the schools that have strong leadership tend to have positive trends. And I just want to give a shout out to Amanda Overly for those Madison Elementary scores. They are just awesome. So with that, if there's no other questions, we'll go ahead and move forward.
So to Dr. Boughton and Dr. Scott's point, I think one of the things that's really important to recognize is our shift in thinking, really which started with the move to the instructional reviews, which are a huge improvement in my mind, because rather than being sort of this backward looking autopsy of what you did in the past, it really is a look at who are my kids now and what is happening in my school right now, and how am I serving these children to get them where they need to be. And really that's the only way you're going to move the needle, right? To understand the students that are before you, right? So I want to talk about this opportunity to shift our thinking around achievement, and how tools like Performance Matters, which we're very fortunate to have, really are allowing us to kind of reconceptualize our work from this sort of backward looking to forward looking perspective. So Performance Matters, as you know, is a rich data analytics site, and it's focused both on the history of a student's past achievement data, but also on their current assessment data. And I'm going to show you several examples of that. It has online assessments which are created using either a standards aligned item bank, or it could be teacher designed items or director designed items. The key here is standards alignment, right? So what we have lacked in the past, with the exception of iReady, is really that way for teachers to do formative and summative assessments very quickly, aligned to the standards, and have that data back quickly enough for it to actually inform instruction. And so the example that I give teachers and principals when we're doing professional development is, you know, when I started teaching, taught science, and I would write my assessments based on the standards, but I'd have 150 papers to grade, and I would be kicking myself for every extended response item. And I would be trying to figure out, you know, do I need to reteach these concepts, and who missed what? And our teachers now have this at their fingertips. They can know at a standards level what students know and are able to do, and what they are not yet able to do, to inform the instruction moving forward. So the data analytics side, this is example, and I know this is a lot of data, so let me just talk you through this a little bit. So all of our schools are in the first column on the left, and then we see their SBA ELA scores for their current students, irrespective of what grade they were in 2019. So our schools can know the kids today, the last time they took the state assessments, where were they? And in a flip of a switch, a click of the button, they can look at our demographic groups and really compare them. And so you can see just right off the bat with this, this helps us to see patterns and trends in our data. For example, these two groups stand out to me right away, lots of red. Red is a level 1 student. These are our ELL and our students with disabilities. And schools can drill down into this data all the way down to the student level to understand individual student learning. The other beauty of this is that schools are able to share this data with teachers, so that teachers can look at their individual students and see, okay, well, this is where the students in my classroom today have been, and have that inform the instruction that they're doing today. Here's the same data for the SBA and math. And again, You know, here we have our students with disabilities and our limited English proficiency students quite a bit more red in our schools. I've also selected low-income students as well as our African American and Black and our Hispanic students. Typically, I will say American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander also struggle in these areas, but they're often suppressed because they're such small groups in schools. So not that they are not important, we're still pay attention to all of those students, but wouldn't do you any good to look at a blank column, right? So this data can help us to understand what is my starting point here. But of course, this is 2-year-old data, right? So performance matters because it is a repository for all of our different assessment data. It can also inform us on more recent data and also on data that we have on students who haven't yet taken state assessment. So in this case, these are the current 3rd graders. They've never tested in Smarter Balance before. However, they have taken the DRA and many have taken the iReady. So what we're seeing here is their scores from grade 1 in reading and their scores from grade 2 in reading. So these are current 3rd graders. And we can compare their DRA and their iReady scores. So, so for example, more students did the DRA because it was a required assessment and then did iReady. We can see that from the clear bar here. However, even though looking at these 2 scores, we see more students have not taken the iReady, we can compare these lower levels, the level 1 students, so below standard, at standard, or above standard, and see that we have some groups that have more in that red and yellow zone. And principals can drill down into those demographic groups to actually look at who are those students and whose class are they in. And they can provide that data to teachers so that they can identify who are those students who in 1st and 2nd grade did not demonstrate mastery of the reading standards. So let's make sure we don't miss out this year as we go into that first exam for Smarter Balance. Let's make sure they have interventions that are going to help to get them on track. Here we have an example of the 6th grade data. So 6th graders did take the SBA. They took it in 4th grade, but they took the iReady math assessment in both 4th and 5th grade. So the nice thing about this is we have a look at where they were mid-year in iReady in 4th grade and then where they were at the end. Notice we have more students at the end of the year in this blue zone, meaning above standard level 4. So we know positive things happen in terms of learning between this winter iReady and the spring SBA. But now we can see their 5th grade iReady scores, and I picked winter just to get that winter to winter view. So I know that there are some students who've been in the red zone for all 3 years, and I want to identify who those students are, make sure they're getting those online assessments in iReady consistently and getting caught up. And again, you're seeing the aggregate, but our principals can drill down to the students and they can share that information with teachers. So this can inform teacher actions, which could be interventions for some students, could be enhancements for others. This is actually a work of beauty in my eyes, but then, you know, I like data. What I love about this is a school that in our district has already done an online assessment in Performance Matters. This is the Math 7 pretest. One of our middle schools did. And the intention here was to get an assessment of where these students were coming off of that spring remote learning. And you can see just the visuals. So we've blocked off all the names here for you, but teachers can see which of these standards did students achieve to a high level in purple versus gray not met. And each of these columns is an actual standard. So you can see here 6 EE A3, 8 EEB. I couldn't tell you what those standards are, but the math teachers can, and they would know from this who are the students who are going to need reteaching of standards from a prior year, who are ready to move on. This is really exciting. I just cannot tell you how exciting it is that so quickly our teachers and principals are attempting to give these online assessments and really get the good data out of them. So here's a student, for example, who's met all but one standard. Very strong showing. I highlight this because we have a bunch of students who didn't demonstrate it at all, and then other students who demonstrated it quite well. And so this would be a time to group those students, pull out the students who haven't met that standard and do some reteaching with them. This is another test that we have given, the mid-year area, surface area test. And I've combined it with the grade 4 SBA. So these are 6th graders. Here is their mid-year test this year. And then here's their SBA and each of the components of the SBA. So communicating reasoning, concepts and procedures, and data analysis. Now, why this is important is because what the school can then do is look at their performance on this mid-year test and compare it to the strand scores to identify students who might have been missing some key areas in grade 4 that need to be addressed. And I, for some reason, picked only kids in blue and green. So the only student who's low here is this level 2 student right there. And then this is a different view. And this really, I think, highlights the power of performance matters to help us understand student learning. So this is current 9th graders, 7th grade SBA, and their math grades and their math course, and their amount of growth. So here we have what level they fell into in SBA, the strand scores for communicating reasoning, concepts and procedures, and problem solving and data analysis. And then we also have their SGPs. So how much did those students grow from 6th to 7th grade? And then what was their last middle school, so their 7th grade math score when they took this SBA? So you can see we have some students, they may have been able to pass the SBA. Oh, sorry, we'll start with the one that didn't. So here's a student who didn't pass the SBA, got low scores in every strand score. You got a C+ in class though. Excuse me. I'm not in talking shape.
Take your time. You're on a roll for a while.
So I'd be wondering about this score and what it meant about his learning. Here's a student that while they scored in level 2, had high scores in communicating reasoning and concepts and procedures, but low in problem solving and data analysis, low growth overall and a D in math. So I'm gonna want to intervene with this student. And I have all of 9th grade to do it because they're not gonna test until 10th grade for their math test. And then finally, you know, here we have a student level 3, high scores and everything, high growth, but a D+. And that makes me wonder, is this standards-based grading, compliance grading, what's going on here? So the other element of performance matters is the ability when we design these tests to really dig in deeply to students' understanding of the standards. So this would be a Math 117 test. So that would be Algebra 1. And you can see on this test, 7 standards were assessed, but it was a fairly short test with only an item or so for each standard. So definitely if students didn't meet the standard, we'd want to go back and do some more testing. We wouldn't want to make all our decisions based on 1 or 2 items. However, if this were a beginning of the unit test, I could draw some conclusions from this. For example, we have one standard here where everybody met the standard. So that would tell me that I wouldn't necessarily need to spend a lot of time maybe here. They have it deeply, but I have other standards where no one has met the standard yet. For example, this one, 97 out of 141 students haven't met the standard. I wanted to do some reteaching definitely of that standard. Here we have one where it's a little bit more spread out. And when a teacher digs into their data, they actually can see how students responded. So they can see their actual response. Here we have a student, for example, where you can see did really poorly on basically all elements of the test. That is an intervention moment for sure. We have another student who did not score well on part of the test, but did very well on other parts of the test. Another student who did really well on everything. And we can also see that there are certain questions that students really struggled in. And we can get an item analysis of that individual item to understand where students learning, where they were struggling. We can see here, this is an item that had 3 questions and students either did well on all or not. And this all feeds really into a profile of a student that identifies all of the standards over time that they have mastered, they're at the beginning of mastery, or they have not mastered. So the teacher can really monitor by standard how students are acquiring these different standards, knowledge and skill in these standards. Okay, so I'm going to take a pause here before we go on to iReady, just to check in. If there are any questions.
So more great information. I mean, this is such a powerful tool. It's just so cool. Yeah, it's really fun to see all the data points come together like this. Directors, are there any questions?
It looks to be a very useful tool, and thank you very much for sharing it with us. I really appreciate that, Catherine. My question is, when you start seeing a lot of tests like in the gray area, where you have a lot of kids who have not received that information, how do you assess how much time it's going to take to have to go back and reteach that area, so that you wonder if you're going to be able to cover all of the standards? How do you do that? I mean, if we find that certain areas require reteaching, how do we know how much time we're spending on the reteaching and not finishing up the required standards for that particular time period, that year or the semester?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And it's really important to remember that student skill and knowledge builds over time, right? And this is really the argument and the power behind iReady, which you're going to see in just a moment. But when we have students who don't achieve standards, if we just continue on, then the gaps in student learning become a chasm, okay? They just grow over time. And so programs like iReady at the elementary level, which identify by standard where those gaps are and provide that online learning, that can be happening sort of in the background so that students are filling in the gaps while they are staying up on that online learning. By filling in the gaps, what they are doing there is they're making it possible to access the grade level learning that's happening in the classroom. When you don't have a program like that, you have to think of other ways to intervene. And certainly teachers have other methods of intervention, but even without iReady, as a teacher, you do have to look at this data and say, okay, is this a misunderstanding of a concept that I can do a small reteach with a group of students who missed it? Or do I have a class who did not get what I taught and I need to reteach it to the whole class because moving on, there's going to be this gap in their learning that will prevent them from understanding that next concept, right? What I love about Performance Matters from this perspective is that it is very simple for a teacher to create a quick check based on the standards for their classroom. And basically you could give a short check-in at the end of every lesson and know 15 minutes later, can I move on? Do I have to reteach to a small group or do I need to reteach this lesson entirely? And honestly, that didn't exist in the past. It really didn't. It would be, you know, I can remember, like I said, taking home little scraps of paper and trying to like, this child didn't get it, this child did, you know, and that's crazy, right? But this is such a powerful tool.
Thank you.
It's a really good question and a really good explanation of how that works. Thank you. Other directors?
I just have a quick question. So you gave or you showed the example of a student who did really poorly on the testing, but then did, you know, pass the class and then kind of vice versa. In those scenarios, what would a typical intervention be? Because, and I guess where my concern is in that is, you know, all kids have different learning styles. And so do they kind of get the pat on the back they need because one thing resonates with, you know, one style or whatever resonates with a student versus another?
Right. So, you know, one thing to keep in mind is that there's not one metric in a classroom or in a school that says, you know, this child learned X, right? You are triangulating. And so what we want to be sure we're doing is that we are assigning grades based on standards and not based on things like compliance or volume or quantity, right? So turning in a lot of work that is not done well or right is not going to translate into learning. It's just going to translate into, you know, a good habit, right? So teachers really always need to be triangulating that. So if I have a student who doesn't do well on my assessment, but has a history of turning in work that demonstrates they understand it, then I might be doing something like checking in individually with that student and doing a short formative assessment with them, you know, because you can be sick. You can also have difficulty with assessments. There's a lot of reasons. So it's that triangulation of data that happens formatively and summatively in the classroom that really tells us whether or not students are learning.
And
Perfect.
Catherine,
Yeah.
oh, sorry. I was just going to actually just chime in. I think one of the other pieces that we also have to remember is that often the standards are not like, we don't just say, oh, we're going to teach reading, literature, RL 3.1 in November and then never touch it again. Often these standards embedded within our curriculum actually are spiraled. So we are hitting RL 3.1 in November, in December, again in January, they're embedded. And so there are multiple opportunities for students to demonstrate standard in different parts of the year. And so you might think about one of the things that we've done in the academics office is the content area directors have identified in instructional maps those what we call the essential standards. So the standards that students need to have to be successful, that that they're going to have to embed those throughout the instructional map. So we can say, here's where 3.1 lives. Let's make sure we're hitting those pieces. And if kids don't get 3.1, then we need to build in some reteach, which we have included in some of the intervention pieces in our instructional maps as well. So coupled with tools like performance matters that tell us whether or not students are getting that standard or not getting that standard based on our instruction, and with remediation and support tools like iReady, where we can capture some of those gaps and get them, make them smaller in an intervention tool, we're also really actively looking at what do kids need to know and where do we scope and sequence that within the year to make sure that we're spiraling back to get what they need. So as Catherine talks about that trifecta, we constantly are thinking about how do we help support students using curriculum, using assessment, using good instructional practices together.
And that sounds perfect, because I think, to both of your points about the triangulation, because where I get concerned as a director and also as a parent is that sometimes kiddos get missed, right? Because to your point, it's like some of the kids who are getting the praise and the good grades, it's because they're turning in these huge quantities of work and they're kind of, if you will, the teacher's pet versus something more objective. And so, yeah, how do you make all those pieces fit? So thank you for that, Dr. Bowden and Dr. Matthews. Great data, love it.
Anyone else before we move on? Okay, Dr. Matthews, you're back on.
All right. So another element of achievement that we're very fortunate to have is iReady. So iReady is a diagnostic assessment that's aligned to the standards and provides standards level information about what students have already mastered and what they have not yet mastered. And more importantly, again, to my point earlier about, simply giving a test doesn't change anything. It's what happens after you have that data. iReady provides that next step, which is an online learning path aligned to the standards, which is targeting those gaps or next steps for learning for students. So here we have our fall iReady assessment, and one of the improvements this year is to give us this data back in 5 categories instead of 3 as in the past. And so we know who is at mid-grade level or above, in green on early on grade level, so ready to start the year on track, up to 1 grade level below, 2 grade levels below, and then 3 or more. Of course, we don't want students to be in that zone. Students in grades 1 through 5 in math take this assessment in the fall and winter, and then optionally in the spring. We did have 361 of our 1,441 kindergartners take it as well. And they took it at home this year, so working very closely with principals and then principals with teachers to ensure a strong administration remotely of this assessment. And we can see here the percent of students who are early on grade level or above, a high in grade 5 of 45% of students in that zone, and then a low in grade 6 of 32% of those students. So we have some students who are substantially behind, and this is in math. So certainly want to be sure that they're using that online learning path, and I will show you how that plays out in just a moment. Here's our reading scores, and as with our other metrics, reading surpassing math. Reading is required in grades 3 through 5. It's optional in K2, and we did have 341 of our 1,441 kindergartners take it. We had more of our 1st and 2nd grade students, so nearly all of our 2nd grade students, and then about 2/3 of our 1st grade students. 3rd grade had a high of 58% of students at or above grade level. And then 5th grade, so the reverse of math actually, with 46% of students at or above grade level in reading. So this is a lot of data. And I don't think necessarily important to, read every line on the far left, but what I like about this is it does give us a pretty graphic representation of where our grade levels in schools are. So this is the North region in reading. And again, the red is that 2 grade levels and 3 grade levels behind. Yellow is up to a year behind. Blue would be above grade level, and green on grade level. So what you can see from this is that we have a couple of schools that did not test either in kindergarten or in first grade. The remaining schools testing in grades 1 through 5. And, there's some variations. So you can see Hawthorne down here with less students at or above grade level, Whittier and View Ridge, and this is the Port Gardner Cooperative. One of the things to keep in mind is that while we don't want to see a lot of red, right, we also don't want it to all be yellow. So we don't see a lot of red in Jackson's first grade, but we see a huge number of students who are a year behind. Whereas here we see about the same percentage at or above grade level as we do behind. So you really have to look at the whole picture for the individual grade levels to understand where they are at. Here's our central region. And so this is a little bit more consistent across the schools than the North region, where we had some schools that had much lower and some much higher number of percent of students at or above grade level. But we do see large groups of students that are 2 or more grade levels behind. So we want to be sure that we are getting those students in to get their interventions in reading in the online environment. And then here's our South region. So again, more consistent than the North region, also more students in the at or above grade level group. When we look at math, as with the other metrics, we see a lower percentage of students in the at or above, regardless of the school or grade level. But we see the same pattern. So with the North region, we have some schools that are performing a little bit higher than other schools. Here's our central region, and you see that sort of evening out with schools performing, roughly in the same area. We have some schools just slightly higher here at Penny Creek. And then South region, schools performing at a little higher level as well. Again, some consistency across the schools. So again, and I've said most of this, these test scores are important, but what's more important is what our teachers are doing with this data. So we have the online instruction, but we also have very clear information that goes to our teachers about the standards that have been mastered and which have not been mastered, and what those next steps for instruction are. And we have in this program a way to group students by those next steps in instruction. So there's a coherence to the small group activities for filling in those gaps, to your point earlier. So for example, this is one of our math classes, and it's about, it looks like it's about 2/3 of the class on the screen. And you can see that students range in their performance. Here we have one student who's early to mid 5 in all of their domains. So that student is on grade level. But then we have here 2 students that, while they have both overall 4th grade scores, you can see they vary pretty greatly in terms of their domain performance. This top student, grade 3 in measurement, the bottom student early 5, the top student grade 4 in geometry, the bottom student early 5. So a grade level difference, 2 grade levels different. They're going to need different things. Likewise, we see a student who's early 5, yet he has he or she has 2 domains here where he's up to a year behind. So we want to be sure that even though they're overall at that early grade level, that they're getting those gaps in those 2 domains filled in. So from an individual student standpoint, then the teacher gets a report which provides their domain score and then shows what are the standards that this student has actually mastered and what are the next steps for instruction. So what are those gaps that need to be filled in? And you can see that they're very specific. And they are what predicates the online assessment or the online lessons. So this student would get lessons in all of these areas that he or she has not yet mastered. Likewise this year, and this is new, and it is really amazing how quickly this company pivoted on the remote learning needs of schools nationwide. So this is a math prerequisites report. And so they've created a report for teachers and principals that divides students into groups based on the prior year's learning and where those learnings need to be filled in. So for example, this is group A, and it shows that they have met all the essential prerequisite skills. Group B needs some additional support, but we have a group here of 15 students that need an in-depth review of these standards. So this group B might, be a short, small group lesson in these areas, but group C, we're going to want to be sure they're getting their online learning every day or every week, and that they are being pulled in for small group lessons so that those gaps can be filled in. Likewise, every teacher gets an instructional grouping profile that puts students together based on their domain scores so that teachers can really easily grab a group of students and look at their next steps for instruction and do small group instruction very easily. And whether they use the tools for instruction in the iReady system, in addition to that online learning, or they use curriculum-based interventions, the point is we know where these students need help. We know what their gaps are. So it's not guessing about where they need to spend their time. So this is group 1. These are all the recommendations for their next steps for instruction, and they're provided with actual lesson plans. And the really great thing about these lesson plans is that they're really designed to be administered by any adult. So it could be a classroom volunteer, it could be sent home for parents, it could be a paraeducator or a teacher. So the lessons are right there. All right, so the last thing is just to talk a little bit about the new assessments that are being built in Performance Matters that are very much a complement to all of this work. So teachers, we have been through the PD, the entire PD span for our directors, facilitators, instructional coaches, teacher leads, district directors, and where we're at is at a place where teachers and buildings and directors are actually building assessments in the maps aligned to the standards. Because we have this rich resource that is aligned to the standards, as you saw, we're able to get very similar data as we're getting out of, say, the iReady system, in that it's standards-based. And in that way, it can inform our instruction moving forward. And because it is in the hands of teachers and principals and directors, not only do we have tests that are in the instructional maps, but we also have tests that a teacher or group of teacher teams can design themselves collaboratively or individually to get that data about student learning. You can see that as they build tests, they can tag them for the standard and depth of knowledge. So they don't have to use the bank. They can design their own items. They can use tests that they have already created and still get that rich item analysis from the system by tagging the standards. So this is a really exciting step, and it's great to see teachers taking that foray into the work because again, what it's doing is informing their instruction. And if you think about the work that we do, we want everybody to be working at their highest level of expertise, right? So a teacher's highest level of expertise is not, as I was, grading 150 papers by hand when they could have it machine scored and spend their time analyzing the data to inform their instruction. That's the highest level of their work, analyzing that data, informing their instruction, planning for instruction, actually teaching. Likewise, for principals to be able to very quickly get data about their school, their students' performance, they can spend their time analyzing that data, being strategic about it, and working with teachers to inform their instruction to guide school improvement rather than building Excel spreadsheets and color coding them, right? So very exciting opportunity with that element of performance matters. And then that is where I would say, do you have any questions?
Give your voice a pause.
Yes.
I have a question about accessibility to the data points. So in a classroom, I know that paraeducators are often working with some of the smaller groups. Do they have access, or who has access to be able to, I mean, it's just so powerful to see, you know, how to, to reteach and how to regroup and those kind of things. Who gets to see this data other than the teacher in the classroom?
Yeah, great question. So in our schools, we have done a substantial amount of training with our paraeducators to teach them both about the iReady system, but now also about performance matters. And so they work with their principal to ensure that they're trained, and then they can have access to the system. So to your point, many of them are doing some small group interventions, and so they have access to their students and the results and also the tools online.
And that's happening now in our remote environment?
Yes. Yes.
Awesome. Great. Other directors, questions or comments, observations?
Yeah, this is Tracy. Sorry, I've been kind of quiet the whole time because it's just so much information. But iReady, I think, is my favorite thing. And I just have a question. I don't know if it's exactly for Catherine, for Dr. Bowden or Dr. Scott, about, we had, you know, when we were live, some of the teachers would have sort of iReady assignments that the kids could do on their own. But now that we're completely virtual, how are we sort of helping the students with the extra stuff that could help them sort of get ahead or get caught up? I don't know what those different packets were that some of the teachers had that the kids could just sign off versus screen time.
I'm going to jump in real quick and just ask, can we take the presentation down for now?
Yes.
Right then, thank you.
Because that's a question, sorry, it was not really clear. It's like, you know, having the kids when they were in a classroom, having some iReady activities besides their iReady learning. And, you know, we had talked, Brian and I had talked before about elementary school kids, especially those that needed extra assessment pre-COVID. Could they be able to check out the computer since we weren't one-to-one if they needed more at home iReady work with their parent or caregiver? But now in this COVID time, how are we melding iReady work with iReady, extra work, iReady support, but also limiting screen time.
Director Mitchell, we have built in adaptive learning time in the schedule, and we were intentional to build that in so that iReady reading and math could be done within that window of time. But it's always a balance to balance out screen time. I think that's where we differentiate with paraeducators, with teachers, in that asynchronous zone where there are individual check-ins to make sure that students feel supported, engaged, that they can monitor their progress alongside their teacher and any paraeducator assigned to them.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So I had a lot of questions that I wrote down, but it seems to me that kind of all of them are pointing to one thing for me. And I do want to stress how great I think these tools are. Like the fact that you can go from this huge macro overview down to granular student level and really target interventions is a dream in almost any field, whether it's medicine or education or anything. It's great. My concern, and it's just really a question, is how are we keeping track of the bigger picture? So when we look at data like, the North is traditionally having trouble, then there's bigger kind of systemic issues at play that the data doesn't address the why of. What are we doing to kind of increase our visibility of those things?
Right. So, first of all, with the IR process, that really is feeding into that bigger picture about individual schools, but then evaluating all of them in their totality at the midpoint of the year, once we've got the IRs done. The other thing is, remember, schools are building school improvement plans, and so we are always thinking about that, macro level of where schools are overall. And you're right, it's that balance of understanding, where are we, what are the trends, but also who do I have in front of me today, and how am I going to meet those individual student needs? I don't know if Dr. Scott Burton or any of the other.
Can I jump in really quick? I just want to clarify, we also have categorical program supports, and those are based on needs. So not only with the IR process, but also the needs assessments done by each individual schools. There's categorical program funds based on PD that's needed, instructional support that's needed, as well as we have our LAP high poverty schools, and that's based on percentage of high poverty.
And that was a really good question. If I might just chime in, Madam Chair and team. So one thing, if you look at, let's say, our red schools, as we would call them, okay, it goes back to the whole system tonight, okay? They get priority. So if there's a teacher vacancy in that school, those red schools get priority, okay? If they need the PD first, they get priority, because at the end of the day, the entire Everett school district has to make, we're making those gains for kids, right? We're we don't get into like, we one area versus another area. So we look at the red schools, wherever they fall, okay, and they fall in a certain area, but they would get priority, okay? Especially when you do the hiring piece. And then all the things that you heard tonight, which was, music to my ears, and I know Catherine loves data, and I really appreciate the embracing of how we're looking at the data. But it goes back to this. It will become a culture in the system when we do the reteach. See, when we do the reteach early, we're not in remediation late, right? And from the performance matters piece to the iReady piece to the instructional review piece, it comes down to what does that reteach is. So there's some kids that are gonna have mastery no matter what, right? Some youngsters are gonna go through the system with mastery. But when we look at our data, okay, there's a gap for the reteach. And that's where we're working towards. And then taken these, I don't even call them programs, I call them tools, right? iReady is a tool, it's a diagnostic tool, it's an assessment tool. And then the performance matters is you do break it down, okay? Is attendance the core of the issue in some areas? Is the attendance the core? What is that attendance core? So that means that we get to chat shop and say, okay, we need that parent liaison to work on that so we can get the academic piece. And in fairness to our public that's hearing this tonight, you don't get performance matters, you don't get iReady unless your board is very focused on student achievement, and you are. And in time, okay, in time, these tools that we have will really separate us among all districts because we're breaking it down kid by kid by kid. And the training begins with the principal and the teacher and the principal, okay? The paraprofessionals, the community, but that principal leadership and that teacher in the classroom are going to make the huge difference. I want to go back to Madison Elementary. We go back to the early slide, okay? There's a school that taught the standards-based instruction. We're not teaching the test, we're teaching standards-based because the kids have to know the standards to move through the system, right? And when you master the standards, boy, confidence really erodes in yourself. Social emotional learning comes to the fore. It's confidence in what you're learning. And then when you don't get it, that reteach builds the confidence too. So when we look at this data, there are some huge gaps, no doubt about it. And that's a beautiful thing because we're on the path to move forward with instruction. The core of the system of any public school system is instruction. So I do want to commend you for those questions, and understand that when we look at our regions, you know, there are priority schools, as we call it, however we want to call those words. They get the first thing. If there's a vacancy in that school, that's the urgency. What I used to call, you know, the whole team get in there and get them what they need, okay? Because they're called priority schools, and the instructional review process brings it to light, okay? And I just appreciate the support of the board because the public is learning the work that we're doing, and we're sharing to the public the good and where we're weak, right? We're sharing where we're really strong at and what we're going to grow at, and in time you'll see these student achievement gains in small increments because the reteach is going to be evident. So I just wanted to share that. I let the team speak a lot tonight. I want to say a few words if that was okay. Thank you.
I do really appreciate all of those responses. It makes me feel confident that we're really trying to look at as much as we can. And like as a board member, as a team here together, trying to do the best we can for our children, there's things that happen to our children and our families that are outside of our control, right? So poverty, racism, all these type different things that we can't necessarily control. But this data, to me, it looks like it can give us the power to kind of zero in on some of those things and work with our partners on city council, county council, at the state level to help address those issues. So to me, that's kind of where I'm going with this. And overall, I think it's fantastic, and I can't wait to see what we do with it. So thank you all very much.
Absolutely. I want to say I completely agree with what you just said. It's powerful and meaningful, and it's just getting better. I have to say, Dr. Matthews, this is one of the best presentations I've seen in my time here. So any other directors want to add or questions? Well, and hearing none, I think that brings us to the end of this special meeting and study session. And we're just about on time here. Director Lassane, did you have something you want to say? Or are you good?
Oh, no, I'm good.
Okay.
Thank you.
So with that, we will go ahead and adjourn. And once again, a huge thank you to Dr. Catherine Matthews for such an excellent presentation. Really, really good, really meaningful, really insightful as a director. And to the rest of you for being here with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you
Have a
so
good
much.
night.
Have a great night.
Have a
Thank
great
you.
night.